October 14th, 1944. A family farm outside Cedar Falls, Iowa. The barn loft creaked under the weight of autumn wind. Inside, beyond the locked door, someone was crying. Not the weeping of a man, the sobbing of a child. Mrs. Helen Krause heard it as she crossed the yard with a basket of eggs balanced against her hip. The sound drifted through the wooden slats, soft and broken, like something fragile had shattered in the dark. She stopped. The prisoners weren't her responsibility. Fraternization was forbidden by military order. But the crying continued, and Helen Krause was a mother before she was a citizen. Before we go further, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, because this story belongs to the cornfields of Iowa as much as the battlefields of Europe. It's about the moment when the rules of war collided with something older, something stronger, and it changed the way an entire generation saw the enemy. She climbed the ladder. Her hands were rough from decades of farm work, her shoulders strong from hauling water and splitting wood. She opened the hatch. In the far corner, huddled beneath a single wool blanket, sat a boy. 12 years old, maybe 13. His Wehrmacht uniform hung loose on narrow shoulders. His boots were 2 sizes too big. He looked up at her with red, swollen eyes and whispered one word in German, Mutti, mother. And in that moment, Helen Krause realized the enemy wasn't who she thought it was. The boy's name was Klaus Becker. He wasn't supposed to exist. By every rule of logic, by every standard of military doctrine, children like him should have been in school. But in the autumn of 1944, Germany was scraping the bottom of a very deep, very dark barrel. The Volkssturm, the People's Militia, was drafting boys as young as 14. In some units, younger. The Hitler Youth, once a propaganda tool, had become a recruitment pipeline. Boys who should have been learning mathematics were handed Panzerfausts. Boys who should have been playing football were taught to die for the fur. Klaus had been captured in France 2 weeks earlier. He'd been part of a shattered division, retreating through the Loire Valley. American forces surrounded them near Orleans. Most of the older soldiers fought. Klaus hid in a cellar. When the G's found him, he didn't resist. He didn't even have ammunition. His rifle was a prop, a symbol of a war machine that no longer functioned. He was shipped across the Atlantic with 300 other prisoners. They arrived at a processing center in New York, then dispersed to labor camps across the Midwest. Klaus ended up in Iowa, not in a prison, on a farm, because by 1944, America had a different problem. The men were overseas. The crops were still growing, and someone had to bring in the harvest. The solution was pragmatic: use the prisoners. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners of war could be employed in non-military labor. By the end of 1944, over 370,000 German Poles were held in camps across the United States. Thousands worked on farms in Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, Wisconsin. They picked corn, hauled hay, repaired fences. They were fed. They were clothed. They were, by the letter of international law, treated humanely. But humane didn't mean warm, and it didn't mean loved. Helen Krause had seen Klaus once before, 2 days earlier, when the army truck dropped off the laborers. He'd stumbled getting out. One of the older prisoners caught him. She noticed his boots, oversized and cracked. She noticed his face, pale and hollow. She didn't think about him again until she heard him crying. That night she went back to the house. Her husband Frank was reading the Waterloo Courier by the stove. She didn't tell him where she was going. She heated a pan of milk, stirred in honey, wrapped it in a cloth to keep it warm. Then she grabbed a quilt from the cedar chest, one her grandmother had stitched, soft, heavy, smelling faintly of lavender and thyme. She carried it back to the barn. Klaus didn't speak much English. Helen didn't speak German. But she sat beside him in the hay. She handed him the milk. He drank it slowly, hands shaking. She draped the quilt over his shoulders. He pulled it tight and closed his eyes. She stayed until his breathing steadied, until the sobbing stopped. Then she climbed back down and locked the door behind her. She told no one, not Frank, not her neighbors, not the camp supervisor, because technically it was illegal. Fraternization with enemy prisoners was prohibited under Army regulation. Contact was limited to work-related instructions. Anything more could be seen as treason, or worse, sympathy for the Reich. But Helen Krauss didn't care about regulations. She cared about a boy who cried for his mother. The next night she brought soup. The night after, biscuits and jam. Klaus began to wait for her by the loft door. He learned a few words. Thank you. Good night. Please. She learned his name, his age, that he had a younger sister back in Munich, that his father had died at Stalingrad, that his mother told him to survive no matter what. By the third week, the other prisoners noticed. One of them, a man named Ernst, spoke better English. He translated. Klaus told Helen about the recruitment, how the officers came to his school, how they lined the boys up and measured their height, how anyone taller than a rifle was taken. He told her about the train ride to the front, the older soldiers who laughed at them, the first time he saw a body, the way it smelled. Helen listened. She didn't judge. She didn't preach. She just brought food and blankets and sat with him in the dark. And slowly something shifted. Not just for Klaus. For her, too. Because the enemy she'd imagined, the faceless monster in propaganda posters, didn't exist. What existed was a child, frightened, alone, far from home. Word spread, not officially, but in the way small-town news always spreads, over fences, at church socials. In the mercantile, other farm wives began to ask questions. What are the boys like? Do they eat enough? Are they cold at night? And slowly, quietly, the unspoken rule began to bend. Margaret Olson, whose farm was 3 miles west, started baking extra bread. She left it in the barn with a note. For the workers. Her husband didn't ask. He just made sure the Poes found it. Louise Hogan knitted socks, thick wool ones in gray and brown. She handed them to the camp guard and said they were donations. He looked the other way. By November, a pattern had formed. The women brought food. The guards allowed it. The prisoners, young and old alike, accepted it with quiet gratitude. The line between captor and captive blurred, not in any official sense, but in the small human ways that mattered. A cup of coffee, a warm coat, a smile that wasn't forced. The transformation wasn't universal. Some neighbors disapproved. Ethel Winters, whose son was fighting in the Pacific, refused to participate. She called it betrayal, coddling the enemy. She wrote letters to the camp commander demanding stricter enforcement. But the commander, a man named Captain Reeves, had seen the camps in Europe. He'd read the reports. He knew what starvation looked like, what cruelty produced. And he decided that if American values meant anything, they meant treating prisoners like human beings. So the adoptions continued. Not literal, not legal, but real in every way that counted. The women didn't see soldiers. They saw sons, nephews, boys who should have been playing baseball, not carrying rifles. And the boys, in turn, began to trust, to smile, to hope that maybe the war hadn't destroyed everything. Klaus stopped crying at night. He started helping with chores before he was asked. He learned to milk cows, to mend fences, to split wood. Frank Krause watched from a distance and said nothing. But one evening, as Klaus carried a load of firewood to the house, Frank held the door open. It was a small gesture. But Klaus understood. He nodded. Frank nodded back. Christmas came. The camp supervisor announced there would be no special provisions for the holiday. The prisoners would work half days, then return to their quarters. No decorations, no services. Just another day. But Helen Krause had other plans. She organized a gathering. Quiet, unofficial. A dozen farm families contributed. Turkey, potatoes, pies. Someone brought a small pine tree. Another carved wooden ornaments. On December 24th, the prisoners were brought to the Krause barn. Not under guard, just escorted. The doors opened. Inside, tables were set. Candles flickered. A fire crackled in the stove. Klaus stared. He hadn't seen anything like it since before the war. The smell of roasted meat, the warmth, the laughter. One of the older prisoners, a man named Otto, began to weep. Not from sadness, from disbelief. That in the middle of a war in enemy territory, strangers had shown them kindness. They ate together, the farmers and the prisoners, the women and the boys. Language barriers dissolved. Someone played harmonica. Someone else sang. The melody was German, the words unfamiliar. But the emotion was universal. Home, family, peace. Captain Reeves arrived halfway through. He stood in the doorway watching. Protocol demanded he shut it down. Report the fraternization, but he didn't. He stepped inside, removed his cap, and accepted a plate of food. Later, when someone asked if he'd file a report, he said there was nothing to report. Just Americans being decent. Just war being temporarily forgotten. That night, as the prisoners returned to their quarters, Klaus stopped at the ladder. He turned to Helen and said in halting English, "You are like my mother. Thank you." Helen's eyes filled. She hugged him. Just once, just briefly. But it was enough. January brought snow. Deep, heavy drifts that buried the fields and silenced the roads. Work slowed. The prisoners stayed indoors more. The women continued to visit. Not every day, but often enough. They brought books, taught English, played cards. The boys taught them German phrases, shared stories, laughed. The war raged on. News from Europe was grim. The Battle of the Bulge, the push into Germany. Every family in Cedar Falls knew someone fighting. Some had lost sons, brothers, husbands. The contradiction was sharp. How could they mourn their own while caring for the enemy? But the women didn't see it as contradiction. They saw it as survival of humanity, of the belief that decency mattered even when everything else was falling apart. Ernst, the translator, began writing letters for Klaus, letters to his mother in Munich, letters that described the farm, the food, the kindness, letters that said, "I am safe, I am warm, I am loved. The Red Cross delivered them, eventually. Months later, a reply came. Klaus's mother thanked Helen. In broken English, she wrote, "You saved my son. God bless you." Helen kept that letter for the rest of her life. By March, the war in Europe was ending. Everyone knew it. The prisoners knew it, too. They listened to radio reports, heard the news of cities falling, borders collapsing. Some of them wept, not for the Reich, but for what would come next. The return, the ruins, the uncertainty. Klaus asked Helen what would happen to him. She didn't know. Repatriation would take months, maybe years. The camps would close. The prisoners would be processed, sent back, or kept in detention. No one was sure. She promised to write, to stay in contact, to help however she could. April 30th, 1945. The radio announced Hitler's death. The prisoners gathered around the set. Silent, some nodded, some prayed. Klaus sat beside Helen and said, "It's over." She squeezed his hand. Yes, it's over. The war in Europe officially ended on May 8th, Victory in Europe Day. Cedar Falls celebrated. Flags hung from every porch. Bells rang. People danced in the streets. But in the barn loft, the mood was different. The prisoners packed their few belongings, said their goodbyes, thanked the families who had cared for them. Klaus gave Helen a small wooden carving. A bird. He'd made it during the winter. She cried. Repatriation began in June. The prisoners were moved to larger camps, processed, interviewed. Klaus was sent to a facility in Kansas, then another in New Jersey. Finally, in October 1945, he'd boarded a ship back to Europe. He carried Helen's address in his pocket, and a photograph. Her, Frank, the farm. A reminder that not all of America was war. Munich was rebel. His apartment was gone. His mother was alive, barely. She worked in a relief kitchen. Klaus found her there. She didn't recognize him at first. He'd grown, filled out. His eyes were different, older. But when he said her name, she collapsed. They held each other and wept. Klaus never forgot Iowa. He wrote to Helen every year. At first, short letters describing the rebuilding. His work as a carpenter, his marriage, his children. Later, longer ones. Reflecting on what those months had meant. How they'd saved him. Not just physically, but spiritually. How they'd taught him that goodness existed, even in war. Helen wrote back. She told him about the farm, the seasons, the harvest. She sent photographs of her grandchildren, of the barn still standing, of the quilt he'd used, now passed down. She called him her son, and he called her Muti, the word he'd whispered that first night, the word that had changed everything. The story of Cedar Falls wasn't unique. Across Iowa, Kansas, Nebraska, and Wisconsin, similar adoptions occurred. Farm wives defied regulations to care for boys who cried at night, who missed their mothers, who didn't want to be soldiers anymore. The military looked the other way. The communities allowed it, because they understood something fundamental, that war dehumanizes. But people don't have to. After the war, many of those relationships endured. Letters were exchanged, visits arranged. Some prisoners immigrated back to the United States, married American women, became citizens, raised families. They named their children after the farmers who sheltered them, after the women who'd fed them. They never forgot. Helen Krauss died in 1982. Klaus attended her funeral. He flew from Munich with his wife and son. He stood at her grave and placed a wooden carving beside the headstone, another bird, just like the first, and he whispered, "Thank you, Mutti." The barn still stands. The farm is gone now, sold and subdivided, but the structure remains. A historical marker was placed there in 1995. It reads, "Site of wartime compassion, where enemies became family." Locals still tell the story of the boy who cried, of the woman who listened, of the moment when humanity won, because in the end, that's what this story is. Not about politics, not about nations, but about people. A mother who heard a child in pain and refused to ignore it. A boy who learned that kindness exists even in the darkest times. And a community that chose mercy over hatred. The war had tried to teach them otherwise, to see only flags and borders, to hate the enemy, to forget that soldiers are human. But Helen Krauss and the women of Cedar Falls refused. They baked bread, they knitted socks. They brought warmth to boys who had none. And in doing so, they proved something essential. That even in war, love survives. That even across battle lines, compassion finds a way. That a quilt and a cup of warm milk can be more powerful than any weapon. Because they remind us of what we're fighting for. Not victory, not territory, but the simple, sacred belief that every child deserves a chance to go home. Klaus Becker lived until 2003. He returned to Iowa 4 times. Each time he visited the barn. Each time he wept, not from sadness, but from gratitude. That in the worst chapter of human history, strangers had chosen kindness. That when the world demanded cruelty, a few people refused. And that their refusal had saved him, not just his life, but his soul. The last time he visited, a reporter asked him what he remembered most. He thought for a long moment. Then he said, "The smell of bread baking, the warmth of hay, the sound of her voice in the dark. I had a rifle in my hands a month before. Then I had a quilt and a woman who smelled like home. I didn't want to be a soldier anymore. I wanted to be a boy again. And for a little while, she let me." That's the legacy of Cedar Falls. Not a military victory, not a strategic triumph, but a quiet, stubborn insistence that humanity matters, that compassion isn't weakness, that feeding the enemy's children isn't betrayal. It's the highest form of courage, and it's a lesson the world still needs to learn